"Will you stay if I undress?" That's what she asked him, a complete stranger, a man who had just pulled her from the jaws of death only minutes before. Her voice was shaken, not from fear, but from the cold that was creeping into her bones. Her lips were turning blue. Her dress, soaked and heavy, clung to her like a second skin. And she knew if she didn't get out of those wet clothes soon, the river wouldn't need to finish what it started. But here's the thing. This wasn't about seduction. This wasn't some scandalous proposition in the middle of the Wild West. This was about survival, about trust, about a widow who had every reason not to trust any man ever again, asking a cowboy she'd never met if he was different from the rest. And what he did next, it would change both of their lives forever. So let me take you back to that freezing autumn day in 1883, back to the moment when a lone cowboy heard a scream that would lead him to a choice that tested every ounce of honor he had left.
His name was Jacob Mercer. And he wasn't looking for trouble that day. He wasn't looking for anything, really. Just a quiet trail through Montana territory, a few days apiece before he'd have to figure out what came next in his life. He'd been riding for 3 days straight. His horse was tired. He was tired. The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones when you've been running from your past for too long. But then he heard it. A scream. Faint at first, carried on the wind like it might have been his imagination. But then it came again, louder this time, desperate. Jacob pulled his horse to a stop and listened. His hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip, but this wasn't that kind of danger. This was something else. He kicked his horse into a gallop, following the sound through the trees until he broke through the brush and saw it. The river, swollen from recent rains, moving fast and angry like it had a score to settle. And there, about 30 yards downstream, he saw her, a woman, thrashing in the water, her arms flailing, her head going under and coming back up, gasping for air. Her dress was dragging her down like an anchor, and the current was pulling her toward a nasty stretch of rocks that would have ended her story right then and there. Jacob didn't think. There wasn't time to think. He jumped off his horse and ran along the bank, his eyes locked on her, calculating the distance, the speed of the current, the angle he'd need. He had maybe 10 seconds before she'd hit those rocks. He dove in. The cold hit him like a fist to the chest. The river was ice melt from the mountains, and it knocked the breath right out of his lungs. But he pushed through it, swimming hard against the current, his arms burning with every stroke. She went under again. He lost sight of her for a moment, and his heart dropped. But then her hand broke the surface, grasping at nothing, and he lunged forward and caught her. Got her. But the river wasn't done with them yet. It pulled at them both, trying to drag them under, trying to separate them. Jacob wrapped his arm around her waist and kicked with everything he had, fighting his way toward the bank. His boots finally found purchase on the rocky bottom. He pulled her up, half dragging, half carrying her through the shallow water until they collapsed together on the muddy shore. She was coughing, choking up river water. Her whole body was shaking violently, but she was alive. Jacob rolled onto his back, his chest heaving, staring up at the gray sky. For a moment, neither of them said a word, just the sound of the river rushing past and their ragged breathing. Then she turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and in them he saw something he recognized, something he'd seen in his own reflection too many times. Loss. Deep, bone-tired loss. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible. You saved my life." Jacob sat up slowly, water dripping from his hair. "You all right? Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs buckled underneath her. The cold was already setting in. Her lips were losing their color, and her fingers were starting to turn white. That's when Jacob realized something. They were miles from town. The sun was already starting to sink toward the horizon, and if he didn't get her somewhere warm soon, the cold would finish what the river started. "Where do you live?" he asked, his voice urgent now. "Is there somewhere close? A town? A homestead?" She nodded weakly, pointing upstream. "Half-mile. That way. Small cabin. I live alone." Alone. That word hung in the air between them. Jacob looked at his horse, then back at her. She couldn't walk, and they were running out of time. "All right," he said, making his decision. "I'm going to get you on my horse. We're going to get you home. Can you hold on to me?" She nodded again, and he lifted her carefully, surprised how light she was, how fragile she seemed in that moment. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, and she slumped against his chest, shivering uncontrollably. As they rode through the trees toward her cabin, Jacob felt her trembling against him, and he wondered what kind of life this woman had been living out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere.
Her name was Eleanor. Eleanor Hartley, though most folks who knew her story just called her the widow from the ridge. She was 26 years old, but if you looked into her eyes, you'd swear she'd lived twice that long. That's what loss does to a person. It ages you in ways that have nothing to do with time. 3 years ago, Eleanor had been a different woman. She'd been a bride, young, hopeful, full of dreams about the life she was going to build with her husband, Thomas. They'd come out west together with stars in their eyes and $50 to their name. Thomas had big plans. He was going to build them a ranch, raise cattle, make something of himself, give Eleanor the life she deserved. And for a while, it looked like those dreams might actually come true. They built a small cabin together with their own hands. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. They worked the land from sunrise to sunset. Thomas would come in every evening, exhausted but smiling, and pull Eleanor into his arms like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She'd never been happier. But the frontier doesn't care about your happiness. It doesn't care about your dreams or your plans or how much you love someone. It was a winter storm that took him. Thomas had gone out to check on the horses during a blizzard. He'd told Eleanor he'd be back in 20 minutes, but 20 minutes turned into an hour, and an hour turned into a night that stretched on forever. They found him the next morning, frozen, just 100 yards from the barn. He'd gotten disoriented in the snow, lost his way in the whiteness, and the cold had claimed him before he could find his way back home. Eleanor buried him on a hill overlooking the cabin. She stood there in the freezing wind, numb in every possible way, and watched as they lowered the only man she'd ever loved into the frozen ground. After that, something inside her broke. People from the nearest town told her to leave, to go back east where she had family, where she wouldn't have to face every day alone in the place where all her dreams had died. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Because leaving would mean admitting it was all for nothing, that Thomas had died for nothing, that their dreams meant nothing. So she stayed. She stayed in that cabin and worked that land by herself. She learned to chop wood and mend fences and hunt for food. She learned to sleep with a rifle by her bed, because a woman alone on the frontier was easy prey for men with bad intentions. She became hard, guarded. She built walls around her heart so high that nobody could climb them. Because caring about people, letting them in, only led to one thing: loss. And she'd already lost enough. But here's the thing about walls. They keep people out, but they also keep you trapped inside, alone with your grief and your memories, and the slowly dying hope that maybe, just maybe, life could be something other than survival. That morning, Eleanor had been at the river washing clothes. It was one of her weekly routines, the same spot she always went to because the water was calmer there. Or at least, it usually was. But she'd been distracted, lost in her thoughts, thinking about Thomas, about the anniversary of his death coming up next month, about how 3 years had passed and it still felt like yesterday. She didn't notice how swollen the river was from the recent rains, didn't notice how the current was stronger than usual. And when she reached out to grab a dress that had slipped from her hands, she lost her footing on the slick rocks. 1 second she was standing, the next she was in the water. The current grabbed her like a giant hand and pulled her under. Her heavy skirts turned into weights. She tried to swim, but the river was too strong, too fast. And for a moment, as the water closed over her head, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Relief. Because maybe this was easier. Maybe letting go was easier than holding on. Maybe the river was offering her a way out of the loneliness and the pain and the endless, exhausting effort of surviving another day. But then her head broke the surface and her body took over. Her arms started flailing. Her lungs gasped for air. And she realized something that surprised her. She didn't want to die. Not like this. Not yet. She'd screamed for help, not expecting anyone to hear, not expecting anyone to care. But someone did. A stranger on a horse. A cowboy she'd never seen in her life. And now, as they rode toward her cabin, soaking wet and shivering, Eleanor realized something else. This was the first time in 3 years that another human being had touched her with kindness. The first time someone had looked at her and seen a person worth saving. And she didn't know what to do with that.
The ride to Eleanor's cabin was quiet, too quiet. Jacob could feel her shivering against him, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. He'd wrapped his coat around her shoulders, but it wasn't enough. They were both soaked to the bone and the autumn wind was cutting right through them. He kept his horse at a steady pace, not too fast, not too slow. Fast enough to get her somewhere warm, but careful enough not to jostle her too much. She looked like she might fall apart if he wasn't gentle. Every now and then he'd glance down at her. Her eyes were half closed, her lips moving slightly like she was talking to herself, or maybe praying. He couldn't tell. "How much further?" he asked, his voice low, trying not to startle her. "Just ahead," she whispered, "through those trees." Jacob nodded and guided his horse through the pine forest. The trees were thick here, blocking out most of the fading sunlight. It made everything feel colder, more isolated. And then he saw it, the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by overgrown grass and a fence that'd seen better days. The wood was weathered gray, and one of the shutters hung crooked on its hinges. There was a small barn off to the side, barely standing, and a vegetable garden that looked like it had been fighting a losing battle against the weeds. This was what she'd been holding on to. This was what she'd refused to leave. Jacob felt something tighten in his chest. He'd seen plenty of lonely places in his travels, but there was something about this one that hit different. Maybe it was because he knew she was out here all by herself. Maybe it was because he could see how hard she'd been fighting just to keep this place alive. Or maybe it was because he recognized it. That desperate clinging to something, anything, because letting go felt like admitting defeat. He had been there himself. He brought the horse to a stop in front of the cabin and dismounted carefully, then reached up to help Eleanor down. Her legs buckled the moment her feet touched the ground, and he caught her, holding her steady. "I got you," he said quietly. "Lean on me." She did, and together they made their way to the front door. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she couldn't work the latch. Jacob gently moved her hands aside and opened the door himself, then helped her inside. The cabin was small, one main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a few shelves holding dishes and supplies. Everything was neat and organized, but there was a sadness to it, like the room was waiting for someone who was never coming back. Jacob helped Eleanor to a chair near the fireplace and immediately went to work building a fire. The wood was stacked neatly by the hearth, dry and ready. Within minutes he had flames crackling to life, and the warmth started to spread through the room. But it wasn't enough, not yet. Eleanor was still shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard he could hear them from across the room. Her wet dress was plastered to her skin, dripping water onto the floor. And Jacob knew what needed to happen next. She needed to get out of those wet clothes, now, before hypothermia set in. He turned to face her, keeping his distance, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "Ma'am, you need to get out of those wet clothes. You're freezing. If you don't warm up soon, you're going to be in serious trouble." Eleanor looked up at him with those storm-gray eyes, and for a long moment she just stared at him, like she was trying to figure out if she could trust him, like she was weighing the risk of being vulnerable against the certainty of dying from the cold. Finally she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't have anyone to help me. I can't, my fingers won't work." Jacob swallowed hard. He understood what she was saying. She was so cold, so exhausted that she couldn't even undress herself, and she was alone, completely alone, except for him, a stranger. Eleanor's eyes filled with something that looked like fear and desperation mixed together. And then she asked the question that would test every ounce of character Jacob had left. "Will you stay if I undress?" The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Jacob stood there, frozen, understanding the full weight of what she was really asking. She wasn't asking if he wanted to stay. She was asking if he was the kind of man who would respect her, protect her, if he was different from the kind of men who would take advantage of a helpless woman in her darkest moment. She was asking if he was someone she could trust. And what he said next would determine everything. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Hope. The kind of fragile, terrifying hope that comes when you've been hurt so badly that trusting anyone feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. And he understood that his answer, right now, in this moment, would either save that hope or destroy it completely. He took a slow breath and spoke, his voice steady and calm. "Yes, ma'am, I'll stay, but not the way you might be worried about." Eleanor's eyes searched his face, trying to read him, trying to understand. Jacob gestured toward the corner of the room where a folding screen stood, the kind used for privacy when changing clothes. "You go behind that screen. Get out of those wet clothes. There's blankets on your bed. Wrap yourself up in as many as you need. I'll stay right here by the fire, keeping it going, making sure this place gets warm. I won't look, I won't move from this spot. You have my word." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, and then, slowly, she nodded. She tried to stand, but her legs were still weak. Jacob moved forward instinctively to help her, offering his arm. She took it
and he guided her across the room to the screen, then immediately stepped back, returning to his position by the fireplace. He heard her move behind the screen, heard the rustle of wet fabric, heard her struggling with buttons and laces that her frozen fingers couldn't quite manage. He heard a small, frustrated sob escape her lips. "You all right back there?" he asked, his eyes fixed firmly on the fire. "I can't. My hands won't." Her voice broke. Jacob closed his eyes. This was harder than he thought it would be. Not because he was tempted, but because he could hear her suffering and every instinct in him wanted to help. But he knew he couldn't, not like that. Some boundaries mattered more than comfort. "Take your time," he said gently. "There's no rush. The fire's going strong. You're safe. Just do what you can." Several minutes passed. He added more wood to the fire. He found a pot and filled it with water from the bucket by the door, setting it near the flames to heat. He kept himself busy, kept his back turned, kept his word. Finally, he heard her voice, softer now, but steadier. I'm covered." Jacob turned around slowly. Eleanor had emerged from behind the screen wrapped in 2 thick quilts, her wet hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, but also relieved, like some terrible weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She made her way to the chair by the fire, and Jacob helped her settle into it. He grabbed another blanket from the bed and draped it over her lap. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, pulling the blankets tighter around herself. "Yes, thank you. Thank you for—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Jacob dragged the other chair over and sat down across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. He held his hands out toward the fire, warming them. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Any decent man would have done the same." Eleanor looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before, something that looked almost like surprise. "You'd be surprised," she said quietly. "Decent men are harder to find than you'd think, especially out here." Jacob didn't respond to that, because she was probably right. He'd seen enough of the world to know that kindness wasn't as common as it should be. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls. Eleanor was still shivering, but less violently now. The color was starting to return to her cheeks. She was going to be okay. The danger had passed. But Jacob knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not while she was still this weak. Not while night was falling and she was out here alone. What if she collapsed? What if the cold came back worse? What if something happened and there was nobody around to help? He made a decision. "I'm going to stay tonight, just to make sure you're all right. I'll sleep out in the barn, give you your privacy, but I want to make sure you're through the worst of this before I move on." Eleanor looked at him, and for a moment he thought she might argue, might tell him to leave, might say she didn't need his help. But instead, she did something that surprised him. She smiled, just a small one, barely there, but it was real. "I'd appreciate that," she whispered. "I'd appreciate that very much." And just like that, something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet, but something deeper, something that mattered more. Trust. For the first time in 3 years, Eleanor had let someone past her walls, and for the first time in longer than he can remember, Jacob felt like maybe he'd done something that actually mattered. He reached for the pot of water he'd set by the fire. It was warm now, almost hot. "Let me make you some tea. You got any tea leaves around here?" Eleanor pointed to a small tin on the shelf. "Up there, second shelf." Jacob stood and retrieved it, and as he prepared the tea, something strange happened. The cabin didn't feel quite so lonely anymore, and neither did they. Jacob handed Eleanor the warm cup of tea, and she wrapped her hands around it like it was the most precious thing in the world. She brought it to her lips and took a slow sip, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her body. "Thank you," she whispered again. Jacob settled back into his chair, his own hands cupped around a tin mug of water. He wasn't much of a tea drinker himself, but the warmth felt good against his palms. For a while they just sat there in comfortable silence. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside, and inside this small cabin, two strangers who'd almost died in a river that afternoon were finding something they'd both forgotten existed: peace. But Jacob knew this moment was temporary. He knew that come morning he'd have to make a real choice, not just about staying the night, but about what came after. See, Jacob wasn't just passing through Montana by accident. He was running from a life that had fallen apart, from mistakes he'd made, from a version of himself he didn't want to be anymore. 6 months ago, he'd been working on a ranch down in Wyoming. Good job, steady pay, but the ranch owner's son had been a bully and a cheat, the kind of man who thought his daddy's money gave him the right to treat people however he wanted. Jacob had watched him abuse the horses, watched him cheat the workers out of their wages, watched him put his hands on a woman who'd told him no, and Jacob had done what his conscience demanded. He'd confronted him. And when the man threw the first punch, Jacob had finished it. He'd left that ranch the same night, knowing that staying meant trouble he couldn't afford. The owner had money and influence, and Jacob was just a drifter with nothing to his name. So he'd been moving ever since, town to town, job to job, never staying long enough for his past to catch up with him, never letting anyone get close enough to ask questions. He'd become a ghost, a shadow passing through other people's lives without ever really being part of them. But sitting here now, watching Eleanor slowly come back to life by the firelight, something inside him stirred, something he'd thought was dead. The desire to matter, to be more than just a man running from his past, to be someone who built something instead of always tearing things down and moving on. Eleanor set her empty cup down on the small table between them and looked at him with clear eyes. "You saved my life today. I don't even know your name." "Jacob. Jacob Mercer." "Eleanor Hartley. Though I suppose you figured out the Hartley part already. This was my husband's land." "Was," I noted. "I'm sorry for your loss." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "It was 3 years ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime." Jacob nodded. He understood that better than she knew. "Can I ask you something, Jacob?" "Sure." "Why did you jump in after me? You didn't know me. You could have died in that river. Most people would have just kept riding." Jacob thought about that for a moment. Why had he jumped in? He hadn't thought about it at the time. His body had just moved. But now, sitting here, he knew the answer. "Because I've spent too long being the kind of man who keeps riding, and I'm tired of it. I'm tired of pretending that other people's problems aren't my problems, that their pain isn't my pain. I jumped in because if I didn't, I'd just be proving to myself that I'm exactly the man I'm afraid I've become." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and then she said something that hit him harder than any punch ever had. "You're a good man, Jacob Mercer." He looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. "You don't know that. You don't know me." I know enough. I know you risked your life for a stranger. I know you could have taken advantage of me when I was helpless, and you didn't. I know you're sitting here now, soaking wet and probably freezing yourself, making sure I'm all right before you think about yourself. That tells me everything I need to know. Jacob felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen for a long time. What are you running from, Jacob? The question caught him off guard. He looked up at her, and she was watching him with those knowing eyes, eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize a fellow traveler on the road of regret. How'd you know I was running? Eleanor smiled sadly. Because I know what running looks like. I've been doing it myself for 3 years, just in a different way. You run by moving. I run by staying still. But we're both doing the same thing, trying to outrun the pain. Jacob swallowed hard. She was right. God, she was right. I hurt someone who deserved it, but the people who loved him didn't see it that way. So I left, and I've been leaving ever since. Do you want to keep leaving? That was the question, wasn't it? That was the choice. Jacob looked around the cabin, at the life Eleanor had built and maintained all by herself, at the strength it must have taken to stay here after losing everything, at the courage it took to let a stranger in after being alone for so long. And he realized something. Running was easy. Leaving was easy. What was hard was staying, building, committing to something real. No, he said, surprising himself with how quickly the answer came. No, I don't want to keep leaving. Eleanor's eyes softened. Then maybe you should stop. Stop running? Stop running, she echoed. Maybe that's what we both need to do. Jacob looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't expected to find out here in the middle of nowhere. A second chance. Not just for her, but for him too. The barn's probably falling apart, he said slowly, testing the waters. Your fence needs mending. That garden looks like it could use some help. And winter's coming. You're going to need more firewood than you've got stacked. Eleanor's breath caught. What are you saying, Jacob? I'm saying maybe I could stay. Not just tonight, but longer. Help you get this place ready for winter. Make sure you're not out here alone when the snow comes. He paused. If you'd have me, if you'd trust me enough to let me stay. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes, but she didn't look away. I'd trust you, she whispered. I already do. And just like that, Jacob Mercer made a choice. Not to run, not to leave, but to stay. To plant roots, to build something, to matter. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be hard days ahead, whispers from the town about the widow and the drifter, challenges to face, wounds to heal. But for the first time in a long time, Jacob felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And so did Eleanor. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Jacob added another log, and the flames leaped back to life, filling the room with warmth and a soft golden glow. Eleanor had stopped shivering completely now. The color had returned to her face, and though she still looked exhausted, there was something different in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Life. Jacob settled back into his chair, and for a moment they just listened to the sounds of the night, the wind rattling the shutters, the fire crackling, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the darkness. It was Eleanor who broke the silence first. Tell me something, Jacob. she said softly. Before you started running, who were you? Jacob smiled, a sad sort of smile. That's a big question. We've got time. He did. They both did. And maybe that's what happened when two people who'd been alone for so long finally found someone willing to listen. The walls came down, the truth came out. I grew up on a farm in Missouri. Small place, nothing fancy. My father worked the land, and my mother kept us all fed and clothed. I had 2 younger sisters. Good family. Simple life. What happened? Eleanor asked gently. The war happened. Jacob stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. I was 17 when I enlisted. Thought I was doing something noble. Thought I was going to be a hero. He paused, his jaw tightening. War doesn't make heroes. It just makes survivors and ghosts. I came back 4 years later, and I wasn't the same person who left. My sisters didn't recognize me. My mother cried when she looked at me. And my father, he just looked disappointed. Disappointed? Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Because I couldn't stay. I tried. God knows I tried. But everything felt wrong. Too quiet. Too normal, like the world had just moved on and pretended all that death and violence never happened. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't be around people without feeling like I was crawling out of my own skin. So you left. So I left. Told myself I'd come back when I was ready. That was 8 years ago. I haven't been back since. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd shared. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think they'd still want you back? Jacob's eyes glistened in the firelight. I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. I've been too afraid to find out. Fear makes cowards of us all, Eleanor said softly. I understand that better than you know. Your turn. Jacob shifted the focus away from his own pain. Tell me about him, your husband, if you want to. Eleanor's hand went to a small locket around her neck, something Jacob hadn't noticed before. She opened it, revealing a tiny photograph inside. Even from across the firelight, Jacob could see it was a young man with kind eyes and a hopeful smile. His name was Thomas Hartley. He was a dreamer, the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard enough and wanted something badly enough, you could make anything happen. She smiled through her tears. He proposed to me under an oak tree back in Pennsylvania. Got down on one knee in the mud after a rainstorm because he couldn't wait another second. Didn't even have a ring yet. Just his word and his heart and this crazy dream about going west and building a life together. Sounds like he loved you very much. He did, Eleanor whispered. More than I deserved. More than I knew what to do with sometimes. He used to tell me that I was his North Star, that no matter how lost he got, as long as he had me, he could find his way home. Her voice broke on that last word. But he didn't find his way home, did he? Jacob said gently. Eleanor shook her head. The storm was too strong. The snow was too thick. He got turned around. And I was inside by the fire, warm and safe, not knowing he was dying just 100 yards away. That wasn't your fault. I know that in my head, but my heart doesn't always listen to my head. I keep thinking, if I'd gone out looking for him sooner, if I'd insisted he wait until morning, if I'd been paying more attention to the storm instead of cooking dinner. You'd have died too, Jacob said firmly, and he wouldn't have wanted that. No man who loves a woman the way you described would want her to die trying to save him. How do you know? because if I loved someone like that, I'd want them to live, even if it meant living without me, especially if it meant living without me. The truth of those words settled between them like a benediction. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the edge of the blanket. I haven't talked about him like this in 3 years. I haven't let myself. It hurt too much. And now? She thought about that for a moment. Now, it still hurts, but it's different. It's not the kind of hurt that's trying to kill me anymore. It's just remembering, and remembering doesn't have to be a bad thing. Jacob nodded. He understood that too. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people have shared something real, something true. Can I ask you something personal, Eleanor? After everything we've talked about tonight, I think we're past the point of keeping secrets. Jacob smiled slightly. Why did you ask me that question about staying if I undressed? You could have just asked me to turn around. You could have told me to leave. Why frame it that way? Eleanor looked into the fire, considering her answer carefully. Because I needed to know. I needed to know if there were still good men in the world, if kindness still existed, if I could ever trust anyone again, and I needed to know it in a moment when I was completely vulnerable, when I had no power and no defense, because that's when you see who people really are. And she looked at him, and there was something warm in her eyes now, something that looked almost like gratitude. And you showed me that the answer is yes, there are still good men, kindness still exists, and maybe, just maybe, I can learn to trust again. Jacob felt his chest tighten. He didn't know what to say to that, didn't know if there were words that could do justice to what she'd just given him. So he just nodded and smiled and let the fire fill the silence. Outside, the wind had died down, the storm had passed, and inside this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, two broken people had found something they'd both thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the naive kind of hope that believes everything will be easy, but the harder, stronger kind. The kind that says, yes, life is difficult, and yes, we've been hurt, and yes, we're scared. But maybe, just maybe, we don't have to face it alone anymore. Eleanor's eyes were getting heavy now. The warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the day were finally catching up with her. You should sleep, Jacob said gently. You've been through hell today. Your body needs rest. Eleanor nodded sleepily. What about you? I'll keep the fire going for a bit longer. Make sure the cabin stays warm. Then I'll head out to the barn, like I said. Eleanor looked like she wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She stood slowly, still wrapped in her blankets, and made her way toward the bed in the corner. Before she lay down, she turned back to look at him. Jacob. Yeah? Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For staying. For listening. For being you. Jacob felt something warm bloom in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Get some rest, Eleanor. Tomorrow's a new day. She smiled, and for the first time since her husband died, Eleanor Hartley went to sleep feeling something other than alone. And across the room, Jacob Mercer sat by the fire, watching over her, and wondered if maybe he'd finally found a reason to stop running.
Morning came slowly to the Montana wilderness. Jacob woke to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere outside. He'd spent the night in the barn like he promised, wrapped in his still damp coat and using his saddle as a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. What surprised him was how well he'd actually slept. No nightmares, no waking up in a cold sweat, just deep, dreamless sleep, the kind he hadn't experienced in years. He stood and stretched, his muscles aching from the previous day's ordeal in the river. Through the gaps in the barn walls, he could see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. She was awake. Jacob made his way across the yard, his boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. Autumn was giving way to winter faster than he'd expected. Eleanor was going to need serious help preparing this place for the cold months ahead. He knocked gently on the cabin door. "Come in," Eleanor's voice called from inside. Jacob pushed the door open and stopped in his tracks. Eleanor was at the stove, cooking. She'd changed into a simple gray dress, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked different in the morning light, stronger, more alive. The color had fully returned to her cheeks, and there was an energy about her that hadn't been there the night before. "You're up early," Jacob said, closing the door behind him. "Force of habit. On a farm you learn to wake with the sun." "Coffee?" "I'd love some." She poured him a cup from the pot on the stove, and he took it gratefully, letting the warmth seep into his cold hands. "How'd you sleep?" she asked. "Better than I have in a long time," he admitted. "You?" "Same," Eleanor said, and there was something in the way she said it that made Jacob think she was as surprised as he was. She gestured to the table. "Sit. I made breakfast. It's not much, but it's something." Jacob sat, and Eleanor brought over 2 plates. Eggs, bread, and some kind of preserves. Simple food, but it smelled incredible. They ate together in comfortable silence, and Jacob couldn't help but notice how natural this felt, like they'd been doing this for years, instead of just one night. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, setting down her fork, "about what you said last night, about staying, about helping me prepare for winter. And I want to make sure you understand what you're offering. This isn't going to be easy. The town, they're going to talk. A widow and a strange man living on the same property. People will make assumptions. They'll spread rumors. It could get ugly." "Let them talk. I've dealt with worse than gossip." "Have you?" Eleanor challenged gently. "Because out here, reputation is everything, especially for a woman. If people think I'm improper, they'll stop trading with me. They'll turn their backs on me. I could lose everything." "Then we'll make sure they don't have a reason to think that," Jacob said firmly. "I'll sleep in the barn. I'll be respectful. We'll keep everything above board, and anyone who wants to spread lies will have to answer to me." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and then her expression softened. "You really mean it, don't you? You're really willing to stay?" "I really am. But only if you want me to. This is your home, Eleanor. Your land. Your life. I'm not going to force myself into it. If you want me to ride out after breakfast, I will. No hard feelings." Eleanor looked down at her plate, her fingers tracing the edge of the chipped ceramic. "I don't want you to leave," she said quietly. "For the first time in 3 years, I woke up this morning and didn't feel that crushing weight of loneliness. I heard someone moving around outside, and instead of being afraid, I felt relief. Like maybe I wasn't facing another day alone. Like maybe I had someone in my corner." She looked up at him, and her eyes were glistening. "I've been so tired, Jacob. Tired of fighting. Tired of being strong all the time. Tired of pretending I can do this all by myself. And I know it's only been 1 day. I know we barely know each other. But yesterday, you showed me something I'd forgotten existed. Kindness without expectation. Help without strings attached. And I don't want to let that go. Not yet." Jacob felt his throat tighten. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Not romantic, not presumptuous, just connection. "Then I'll stay," he said simply, "for as long as you need me."
Eleanor squeezed his hand, and for a moment they just sat there, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. Then Eleanor pulled her hand back gently and stood up with a new determination in her eyes. "All right then, if you're staying, we've got work to do. That fence isn't going to fix itself, and we need to get at least 3 more cords of wood chopped before the first snow." "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, they fell into a rhythm. Over the next few days, Jacob worked from sunrise to sunset. He mended the fence, reinforcing the weak spots and replacing the rotted posts. He chopped wood until his arms burned and his back ached, building a stack that would see Eleanor through even the harshest winter. He patched the leaky section of the roof that Eleanor had been trying to ignore for months. And Eleanor worked right alongside him. She wasn't content to just watch. She held the posts while he hammered. She stacked the wood as he split it. She handed him tools and offered suggestions and pushed herself just as hard as he pushed himself. They worked together like a team, like partners. And in the evenings, after the work was done, they'd sit by the fire and talk about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their fears and their hopes for the future. Eleanor learned that Jacob loved to read, but hadn't had a new book in over a year, that she used to sing while she cooked, but had stopped after Thomas died, that she was terrified of thunder, but tried to hide it. Jacob learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he was better with animals than he was with people, that he carried guilt about his family like a stone in his pocket, heavy and constant. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Eleanor hummed softly when she was concentrating, the way Jacob always checked the horizon before settling in for the night, like he was still expecting trouble to find him. And slowly, carefully, something began to grow between them. It wasn't love, not yet. It was too soon for that, and they both carried too much damage to rush into something that fragile. But it was the seed of something: trust, respect, companionship, the kind of foundation that, given time and care, could grow into something real. One evening, about a week after Jacob had arrived, they were sitting by the fire as usual when Eleanor said something that surprised him. "I laughed today." Jacob looked up from the piece of leather he'd been working on. "What?" "I laughed," Eleanor repeated, a small smile on her face. "You made a joke about that stubborn goat, and I laughed, really laughed. I can't remember the last time I did that." "The goat is pretty ridiculous," Jacob smiled back. "It's not about the goat," Eleanor said softly. "It's about the fact that I could laugh again, that something inside me that I thought was dead isn't. You did that, Jacob. You brought that back." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, his chest feeling tight in that way that meant something important was happening. "I've brought something back for me too," he admitted. "I've spent years feeling like I didn't matter, like I was just drifting through life without purpose. But being here, working this land, helping you, I feel like I matter again, like what I do makes a difference." Eleanor's eyes were warm in the firelight. "You do matter, Jacob, more than you know." And in that moment, sitting in a small cabin in the Montana wilderness, two broken people realized something important. They were healing. Not completely, not overnight, but slowly, steadily, day by day. They were healing each other.
Now, you might be wondering why I'm telling you this story. Why a tale about a cowboy and a widow in the middle of nowhere matters to you, sitting here watching this video over 100 years later. And the answer is simple. Because this story isn't really about them. It's about all of us. See, Eleanor's question, "Will you stay if I undress?" wasn't just about wet clothes and survival. It was about something much deeper. Something we all struggle with, whether we live in 1883 or 2025. It was about vulnerability. Think about it. How many times in your life have you been in a position where you had to ask someone, "Will you stay if I show you who I really am?" Maybe not in those exact words, but the question is the same. Will you stay if I tell you about my past? Will you stay if I show you my scars? Will you stay if I admit I'm not as strong as I pretend to be? Will you stay when things get hard? That's what Eleanor was really asking. And that's what all of us are asking when we let someone past our walls. Because here's the truth. We all wear armor. We all put on masks. We all pretend we're more okay than we actually are. Because we're terrified that if people see the real us, the broken parts, the messy parts, the parts we're ashamed of, they'll leave. And sometimes they do. Sometimes people prove that our fears were justified. Sometimes vulnerability gets punished instead of rewarded. But Jacob didn't do that. When Eleanor was at her most vulnerable, when she had nothing to hide behind and no way to protect herself, Jacob chose to be the kind of man who stayed. Not because he wanted something from her, not because he expected anything in return, but because that's who he chose to be. And that choice changed everything. See, integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you do when nobody would ever know. It's about the choices you make when you're alone with someone who's helpless, when you could take advantage and nobody would stop you. That's when character reveals itself. Jacob could have been a different kind of man that day, the kind who would have seen an opportunity and taken it, the kind who would have used Eleanor's desperation against her, and nobody would have known. There were no witnesses, no cameras, no accountability, just his conscience and his choice. And he chose honor. Now here's what's powerful about that. His choice didn't just save Eleanor from hypothermia. It saved her from something worse. It saved her from losing faith in humanity completely. For 3 years, she'd been living in a world where the only man she'd ever trusted had been taken from her, where being alone felt safer than risking connection, where walls felt more reliable than people. But Jacob's simple act of decency cracked those walls. It showed her that not all men are the same, that kindness still exists, that trust isn't always foolish. And in doing that, he gave her something more valuable than firewood or a mended fence. He gave her hope. But here's the thing that makes this story even more powerful. Jacob wasn't some perfect hero riding in to save the damsel in distress. He was broken too. He was running from his own demons. He was carrying his own guilt and shame and regret. He was just as lost as she was. And that's what makes their connection so real. They didn't fix each other. That's not how healing works. You can't fix another person, and they can't fix you. But what they did do was create a safe space for each other to heal themselves. Eleanor didn't cure Jacob of his trauma, but she gave him a reason to stop running, a purpose, a place where his efforts mattered, where he could prove to himself that he was more than his mistakes. And Jacob didn't erase Eleanor's grief, but he reminded her that life could be more than just survival, that connection was possible, that letting someone in didn't have to mean losing them. They became mirrors for each other, reflecting back not the broken parts, but the potential, the possibility, the person they could still become. And isn't that what we all need? Someone who sees us, really sees us, with all our flaws and failures and fears, and says,
I'm staying anyway. Not because they're a savior, not because they're perfect, but because they choose to show up, to be present, to extend grace when grace is needed most. Now, I want you to think about your own life for a moment. Think about the times when someone showed you unexpected kindness, when someone chose to stay when they could have left, when someone saw you at your worst and didn't run away. How did that change you? How did it shift something inside you? How did it make you believe, even just a little bit, that maybe you were worth staying for? And now think about the flip side. Think about the times when you had the opportunity to be that person for someone else, when someone showed you their vulnerability and you had to choose how to respond. Did you stay? Did you honor that trust? Or did you do what was easier and walk away? Because here's the truth that this story teaches us. The world is full of people carrying invisible wounds, people who are barely holding on, people who are one act of cruelty away from giving up completely. And we have the power in small everyday moments to either add to their burden or lighten it. We can be the person who takes advantage, or we can be the person who protects. We can be the person who judges, or we can be the person who understands. We can be the person who leaves, or we can be the person who stays. Jacob and Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do isn't dramatic or flashy. Sometimes it's just choosing basic human decency when nobody's forcing you to. It's turning away when you could look. It's offering help when you could ignore. It's staying when you could leave. It's recognizing that someone else's humanity matters as much as your own. And here's what's beautiful about that choice. When you choose to be that person, when you choose honor over opportunity, something changes in you too. Jacob didn't just help Eleanor that day. He helped himself. He proved to himself that he wasn't just a man running from his mistakes. He was a man capable of doing the right thing when it mattered most. He reclaimed his own dignity by honoring hers. And that's the thing about integrity. It's not just about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself. It's about being able to look in the mirror and know that when you were tested, you passed. So what's the deeper meaning of this story? It's this. We're all one moment away from being either Eleanor or Jacob. We're all one crisis away from needing help. And we're all one choice away from being someone's reason to believe in humanity again. The question is, when that moment comes, who will you choose to be? Will you be the kind of person who stays, who honors vulnerability instead of exploiting it, who chooses the harder right over the easier wrong? Or will you just be another reason for someone to build their walls higher? Eleanor asked, "Will you stay if I undress?" But really, she was asking a question we're all asking in 1,000 different ways every single day. Will you stay when I'm not strong? Will you stay when I'm not perfect? Will you stay when staying is hard? And the answer to that question, the choice we make in those moments, defines not just our character, but the kind of world we create. Jacob chose to stay, and in doing so, he didn't just save one woman's life, he reminded all of us what it means to be human.
So that's the story of Eleanor and Jacob. Two broken souls who found each other in the most unlikely of places, at the most desperate of moments. Did they live happily ever after? Did their story end in romance? Did Jacob stay on that farm forever? I'll leave some of that to your imagination. Because the truth is, the ending isn't what matters most. What matters is the choice, the moment, the decision to be decent when decency wasn't required.
What matters is that in a world that can be cruel and cold and unforgiving, two people chose to be kind to each other, and that kindness created a ripple effect that probably touched more lives than they ever knew. Maybe Jacob eventually went back to Missouri and reconciled with his family. Maybe Eleanor learned to love again. Maybe they built something together, or maybe they eventually went their separate ways, forever changed by their brief time together. But whatever happened next, they both walked away from that river with something they didn't have before: hope, connection, and the knowledge that they weren't as alone as they thought. And really, isn't that what we're all looking for? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take this story with you. Think about it the next time someone shows you their vulnerability, the next time someone needs help and you have the power to give it. Ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be in this moment? And then be that person. Because the world doesn't need more people who take advantage. It needs more people who stay. More people who honor trust. More people who choose integrity when nobody's watching. It needs more Jacobs. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a situation where someone showed you unexpected kindness when you needed it most? Or maybe you were the one who had the chance to be that person for someone else. Share your story, because these stories matter. They remind us that despite everything, despite all the darkness and difficulty in the world, human goodness still exists. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps more people find these stories. And subscribe to the channel, because I've got more incredible true tales from history that'll make you see humanity in a whole new light. Next week, I'm bringing you another story that'll blow your mind. It's about a train conductor who had to make an impossible choice that would either save 100 lives or destroy his own family. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember this: every day you have the opportunity to be someone's reason to believe in kindness again, to be the person who stays when everyone else leaves. Don't waste that opportunity. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.